The moment he was removed from his seat didn't begin with shouting, arguments, or even a single raised eyebrow. It began with silence, his silence, and the quiet confidence of a man who understood far more than he revealed. He sat in his assigned seat near the front of the aircraft, a window seat with the sun gently touching the side of his face, casting a warm glow that made him look calm and unreadable. Passengers were still settling in, sliding bags into overhead bins, snapping seatbelts into place, and adjusting air vents above their heads. Everything seemed ordinary, everything seemed predictable, until a flight attendant walked toward him with a forced smile stretched a little too tight. It was the kind of smile that tried to hide discomfort but couldn't hide intention. She stopped beside him, leaning slightly forward as if delivering routine information, but her tone hinted at something else. She informed him that he had to move. No explanation, no apology, just a carefully packaged instruction delivered with the assurance of someone used to unquestioned compliance. The passengers nearby paused, their attention drawn by the sudden halt in the attendant's voice. Some glanced over their shoulders, curious about what rule could possibly have been broken before the plane had even left the gate. He looked up at her calmly, his expression unchanged, his breathing even. He asked no questions. He didn't request a reason. He didn't try to defend his place. He simply nodded once, a small, quiet motion that carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand when speaking was unnecessary. As he stood, a few people exchanged looks. Some shrugged, assuming he must have been sitting in the wrong seat. Others smirked, thinking he must have bought a cheap ticket and tried to sneak into a better one. One man whispered that he probably didn't belong in the front anyway. Another murmured something about rules and hierarchy on planes. Every assumption was built on nothing but appearances, just the way he dressed, the calm way he moved, the fact that he stayed silent. Passengers love stories even before the plane takes off, and in that moment, they wrote one for him without knowing any details. He lifted his bag from under the seat with a smooth movement, showing no frustration, no hesitation. The flight attendant gestured toward the back of the plane, the vague sweep of her hand suggesting urgency but lacking any respect. He followed her direction quietly, stepping into the narrow aisle as others pulled their knees in to let him pass. A child stared at him curiously while her mother gave an annoyed sigh, as if his presence was somehow delaying the departure. He didn't react to any of it. His silence wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of choice. Every step he took toward the back of the aircraft was punctuated by whispers. He could hear fragments of conversations, wrong seat. Maybe he didn't pay for it. Probably got bumped. Must have made a mistake. People didn't bother lowering their voices. They assumed he wouldn't say anything, that he was exactly the kind of man who let things happen to him rather than controlling what happened around him. The further he walked, the more their confidence grew in the story they had already written for him. When he reached the last few rows, the attendant pointed to a cramped middle seat between two passengers who were already annoyed by the lack of space. He didn't flinch, didn't protest. He placed his bag overhead, sat down, and fastened his seatbelt with steady hands. The people beside him barely looked at him. To them, he was just another inconvenience to squeeze past. But even here, in the worst seat on the plane, he sat with the posture of a man who wasn't defeated but rather waiting for something only he understood. Up front, the flight attendant returned to her station feeling as though she had handled a small issue. She didn't question her own assumptions. She didn't imagine even for a second that her decision would be remembered beyond takeoff. But her certainty was built on the fragile belief that the passenger she moved was insignificant. What she didn't know was that silence, especially in moments of disrespect, often belongs to people who hold a different kind of power. The kind of power that never needs to announce itself. Passengers' assumptions spread through the cabin like an invisible current, subtle at first, then gathering strength as more people noticed what had happened. The plane hadn't even begun taxiing, yet the atmosphere already felt charged with a quiet buzz of speculation. Humans, after all, are wired for stories, and when they witness even the slightest disruption in routine, their imaginations rush to fill the gaps. And in that moment, with a silent man being escorted to the back without explanation, everyone felt entitled to interpret the scene in their own way. Those sitting closest had the best view, and therefore assumed they had the clearest understanding. One woman in a business suit leaned toward the man beside her, whispering that he must have been in the wrong seat. The certainty in her voice came not from knowing the facts, but from the confidence people often feel when they think they've witnessed something simple, something they've seen before. The man nodded, already convinced. In his mind, the case was closed. A few rows back, a young traveler with headphones around his neck chuckled quietly, telling his friend that the guy probably tried to snag a premium seat without paying for it. His friend laughed too, their conversation light, careless, the kind of talk that sprouted easily when someone else seemed to be on the receiving end of embarrassment. They didn't consider that there might be more to the story. They didn't think to question why the man hadn't argued. Instead, they assumed silence equaled guilt, that quiet acceptance proved he had been caught doing something wrong. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple exchanged looks heavy with judgment. The wife murmured that some people always think the rules don't apply to them. Her husband agreed with a small nod, his eyes following the man as he walked down the aisle. Their expressions weren't cruel, but they were firm, shaped by years of believing that order must be maintained, and that anyone who appears out of place must have done something to deserve correction. Meanwhile, a teenager pressed against the window typed quickly on her phone, crafting a message to her group chat about a guy getting kicked out of his seat. She added emojis, dramatizing the situation for entertainment. Her friends reacted instantly, sending laughing faces, shocked faces, and theories that grew wilder with each message. None of them had seen the event. None of them knew the truth. But in a world where information spreads faster than understanding, a rumor didn't need facts to thrive. Even passengers who hadn't seen the initial interaction felt the ripple. They noticed the murmurs, the shifting glances, the slight tilt of heads in the same direction. Humans follow the gaze of others instinctively, eager not to miss anything. And as soon as they saw the man settling into the cramped back row, they pieced together fragments of overheard conversations and decided the issue must be his fault. One whispered, maybe he caused trouble. Another suggested, maybe he argued with the crew earlier, building a narrative out of shadows and assumptions. Not a single person asked the flight attendant what really happened. Not one passenger thought to question whether her decision had been fair, or whether the removal had been justified. People rarely doubt authority in enclosed spaces like airplanes, where the environment demands obedience and compliance. When someone is singled out, the general belief tilts toward assuming they must deserve it. And in this case, the man's quiet acceptance only reinforced that belief. They didn't see dignity in his silence. They saw confirmation of their assumptions. His appearance added its own layer to the story others were crafting. His modest clothing, his calm demeanor, his lack of reaction all fed into a stereotype that he was the kind of person who wouldn't or couldn't challenge the authority of flight crew. They judged his status without knowing it. They judged his intentions without asking. They judged his worth without looking beyond the surface. And as he sat in that back row, unaware of the exact thoughts circulating around him but fully accustomed to how quickly people make assumptions, he remained composed. He didn't shift nervously. He didn't shrink into his seat. He simply existed with the quiet poise of someone who had long learned that the opinions of strangers rarely hold the truth. Around him, the passengers continued weaving their theories, satisfied with their conclusions. In their minds, they had solved a mystery, but in reality, they had only revealed how fast people are to judge, how easily they accept the simplest explanation, and how rarely they consider that the quietest person might be the one holding the biggest truth of all. His calm and deliberate reaction became the quiet center of the entire incident, the one detail that unsettled a few observant passengers even though most failed to notice it. The moment he was told to move, something in the air shifted, but not in the way people imagined. They expected frustration, or at least a flicker of irritation, because that's what most people would show when stripped of their seat without reason. But instead, he remained impossibly composed, sitting there with the stillness of a man who had already decided that reacting emotionally would only give others more power than they deserved. His eyes didn't harden, his jaw didn't clench, and his breath didn't change rhythm. It was as if he had known this moment was coming, and he had long prepared himself for it. The flight attendant misread his calmness as compliance, confusing dignity with weakness. She believed she had won the interaction, that her authority had gone unquestioned, that he had accepted the downgrade as someone accustomed to being told what to do. But she didn't know him, didn't recognize that his silence was an intentional pause, not a surrender. He studied her face for a moment, not out of resentment, but out of understanding humanity in its most predictable form. Then he nodded once, a gesture that held no defeat, only patience. When he stood, each movement carried an unmistakable deliberateness. He didn't rush, didn't scramble, didn't give any impression of a man who had been caught or corrected. Instead, he moved with the kind of slow, measured grace that made a few people look twice. There was a steadiness in his hands when he picked up his bag, a clarity in his motions that suggested control, not confusion. He didn't fiddle with his belongings or hesitate before stepping into the aisle. He walked with the posture of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Some passengers sensed it, but most ignored it. People often overlook quiet confidence because it doesn't demand attention. It doesn't shout or gesture or insist on being noticed. But the few who did notice found themselves pausing mid-thought. One elderly man frowned slightly, wondering why the passenger's expression didn't match the situation. He expected embarrassment or irritation, but instead he saw a strange, unwavering calm. Another woman watched him walk past, puzzled by the steadiness in his eyes. Something about him didn't align with the assumptions filling the cabin. Yet those small sparks of curiosity died quickly beneath the weight of louder assumptions. Most people simply assumed he lacked the courage to speak up. They mistook intention for passivity, strength for submission. They didn't understand that some people don't need to raise their voices to communicate power. As he walked down the aisle, he didn't glance around in discomfort or bow his head in self-consciousness. He kept his eyes forward, taking in the rows of seats with a quiet awareness. He wasn't trying to appear humble, nor was he trying to appear strong. He was simply carrying himself the way he always did, in a manner shaped by years of discipline, responsibility, and an identity that didn't depend on external validation. When he reached the back and sat down, his posture remained straight, not stiff but grounded. He fastened his seatbelt with the same composure he had shown earlier. There was no sighing, no shifting, no restless tapping of fingers. He placed his hands on his lap, relaxed, like a man waiting for a meeting to start rather than someone who had just been publicly displaced. His calmness made even the cramped middle seat feel different. The passengers beside him expected him to grumble or adjust constantly, but he did none of that. He simply sat, breathing steadily, his presence almost too serene for the chaos of economy class. This quiet strength created an odd contrast with the restless energy of those around him, who fidgeted and complained about legroom or boarding delays. The flight attendant, after returning to the front, glanced back at him once. She expected to see frustration or discomfort, something to reassure her that she had been right to move him. But seeing him sitting so quietly, so peacefully, unsettled her more than if he had argued. She didn't understand that calmness can be its own confrontation, its own kind of mirror that reflects the insecurity of those who misuse authority. What none of the passengers realized was that his silence wasn't a lack of reaction. It was the reaction. A strategic one, controlled one. A reaction chosen by someone who had learned to master his emotions, not let them master him. His calm wasn't emptiness. It was intention. It was the steady heartbeat of a man who knew that truth, once revealed, would speak louder than any protest he could have made in that moment. Whispered conversations began spreading through the cabin like a slow-burning fuse, igniting row by row, aisle by aisle, as passengers tried to make sense of what they believed they had witnessed. At first, it was only a murmur, a soft hum mixing with the sound of overhead bins closing and seatbelts clicking into place. But whispers have a way of multiplying, especially when people think they've seen something unusual. Soon, fragments of questions and assumptions floated through the air, stitching themselves into a narrative that had little to do with truth and everything to do with human impulse. The people in the first few rows had the privilege of proximity, so they took it upon themselves to become the unofficial storytellers. A businessman sitting directly across from the empty seat leaned slightly toward his companion and whispered that the man must have been in the wrong section. His companion nodded immediately, eager to agree, as though acknowledging the assumption made it more factual. Their whispered analysis drifted backward, carried by tilted heads and curious ears. A woman diagonally behind them leaned forward to share what she had heard, even though she had heard nothing except her own assumptions. She lowered her voice with a kind of pride, weaving a confident explanation about ticket upgrades and people trying to sit where they didn't belong. Her whisper traveled next to a mother who then passed it to her teenage son with her own embellishments, transforming speculation into certainty. The boy, uninterested but eager to entertain drama, repeated a simplified version to his sibling, who then stared toward the back of the plane to catch a glimpse of the supposed troublemaker. In another section, a group of college students traveling together picked up bits of the story and spun them into something more entertaining. One claimed the man must have been caught arguing with staff earlier at the gate. Another added that he probably tried to sneak into business class. A third joked about how people always try their luck. Their whispers turned into chuckles, and though their laughter was light, it still contributed to the growing narrative that painted him as someone in the wrong. The whispers traveled down the aisle like wind slipping through a narrow canyon. Each row shaped the story differently, based on what they assumed, what they wanted to believe, or simply what they found entertaining. Some passengers whispered because they genuinely thought they were discussing an interesting moment. Others whispered because gossip gave them a fleeting sense of belonging, a shared secret among strangers trapped together inside a metal tube miles above the ground. Even passengers who had seen almost nothing of the interaction felt compelled to add their interpretations. A man near the middle claimed he saw the attendant politely ask the passenger to leave the seat, even though he had been focused on his phone. A woman across from him, eager to sound informed, whispered that the man must have refused to comply at first. She hadn't witnessed anything at all, but whispers thrive on confidence, not accuracy. Some whispers carried undertones of annoyance. People muttered that the incident might delay takeoff, that some passengers always cause issues, that it was better he was moved now rather than later. A few shook their heads dramatically, convinced they were in the presence of a troublemaker, despite the utter calmness he had displayed. But among all these voices, a few more perceptive passengers sensed that something didn't add up. They whispered too, but their tone was different. One elderly woman murmured to her husband that the man didn't look like someone making a mistake. A young woman with headphones resting on her shoulders whispered that his expression hadn't shown a hint of guilt or embarrassment. A father quietly told his teenage daughter that the man seemed too composed, too dignified, for the story people were inventing. Their whispers were softer, less certain, but they were swallowed quickly by the louder, more dramatic theories around them. Even the flight attendants weren't immune to the spreading speculation. One of them, unaware of the true reason behind the seat change, whispered to a colleague that she wondered if the passenger had a problem with his ticket. The colleague shrugged and whispered back that sometimes the airline made last-minute adjustments. They kept their voices low, but passengers caught fragments, and those fragments became new seeds of rumor. Meanwhile, the man at the back did nothing to stop or counter the whispers. He didn't turn his head. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't engage with anyone around him. His silence created a vacuum that the whispers eagerly filled, because people find it easier to craft stories than to sit with uncertainty. And so the whispers grew, layered, distorted, repeated, reshaped, until they formed a thick cloud of assumption that settled over the entire aircraft. Each whisper traveled farther than the one before it, building a narrative that made sense only because people agreed to believe it. None of them realized that the story they were creating would fall apart the moment his true identity reached the crew, shattering every whisper that had dared to question his worth. The shocking revelation of his true identity didn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic announcements. It slipped into the atmosphere of the cabin quietly, the same way a single spark can go unnoticed before it suddenly sets everything ablaze. It started with a simple message, a quick call from the gate supervisor to the lead flight attendant. Just routine communication at first, the kind crews exchange every day. But then there was a pause. A longer pause. A pause that made the attendant's face stiffen. Her eyes widened just slightly, as though she had misheard something important. She asked the supervisor to repeat the name, the title, the credentials, and when she heard it again, her breath caught, because the pieces she dismissed so easily earlier suddenly shifted into place. The man she had casually escorted to the back wasn't just another traveler. He wasn't a confused passenger or someone trying to sit where he didn't belong. He wasn't a troublemaker or a rule breaker, or any of the things the whispers had painted him to be. He was someone far more significant, someone whose presence on the flight carried weight she hadn't recognized. A figure with authority, influence, and a level of respect that demanded more care than she had shown. Her eyes flicked toward the front row where he should have been sitting, and then toward the back where she had sent him. Color drained from her face as reality settled in like a cold gust of wind. She replayed the moment she approached him, the tone she used, the assumptions she made, the lack of explanation she gave. Every detail returned with sharp clarity, and the more she remembered, the deeper her discomfort grew. Her colleague noticed the shift in her expression and leaned closer, whispering a question. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she passed along the name, the identity, the truth she had just learned. Her colleague's eyes widened, mirroring her shock. They exchanged quick, uneasy glances, both realizing the gravity of their mistake. Word traveled fast among the crew, moving in hushed conversations behind curtains and discreet gestures shared during walkthroughs. Each attendant who learned the truth felt the same jolt, the same sinking sensation, the same urgent need to make things right. But the seats were filled, the aisles were crowded, and the man they had underestimated now sat quietly at the back, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of the storm he had quietly triggered. The crew began subtly gathering information from the gate team, confirming details one by one. The more they learned, the more intense their reactions became. Some pressed a hand to their forehead, realizing the scale of their oversight. Others whispered in disbelief, glancing repeatedly toward the back, trying to reconcile the humble image before them with the powerful reality they now knew. One attendant murmured that she couldn't believe they had asked someone of his status to move. Another whispered that this could have serious consequences, both professionally and for the airline. Meanwhile, the flight's purser, the highest-ranking crew member on board, stepped into the aisle with a new urgency in her stride. She wasn't rushing, but her movements held a deliberate intensity. She needed to verify the situation herself, to confirm the identity with her own eyes. As she approached the back of the plane, other attendants watched her, waiting for her reaction like people waiting for a verdict. When she reached his row, she paused, studying him discreetly. His posture, his calm, his quiet presence, it all matched the description the supervisor had given. She knew it instantly. Though she didn't say anything to him at first, the realization hit her with the force of a collision. She offered a polite nod, but inside her mind raced through protocol, etiquette, and the respect owed to someone of his standing. She walked back toward the front, her expression composed but her heartbeat unmistakably faster. Behind the curtain, she whispered urgently to the others, outlining what needed to happen next. But nothing spread faster than the reaction of the crew. Their sudden shift in tone, their hushed urgency, their constant glances toward the back. They didn't go unnoticed. Passengers began to sense that something was happening. Their whispers grew again, but this time they carried a different tone. Curiosity, confusion, suspicion. A few people started asking attendants what was going on, but the staff, now fully aware of their mistake, offered tight smiles and vague reassurances. The atmosphere changed. The casual confidence of earlier whispers now felt shaky. Passengers looked around, trying to piece together what they had missed. Some noticed the way attendants spoke more respectfully whenever they walked near the back. Others noticed that the man himself hadn't reacted at all. No impatience, no smugness, no visible shift in demeanor. He remained just as silent, just as calm, as though he had expected the revelation to come eventually. And that was the part that struck the attendants the most. The quiet certainty he carried, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when others fail to see it. The truth of his identity didn't just shock the crew. It humbled them, reminding them how quickly appearances deceive and how costly assumptions can become when the person being judged holds far more power than anyone realizes. The flight crew's stunned response and sudden shift in behavior was immediate, almost palpable, as though a hidden switch had been flipped in the cabin. One moment, they had moved through the aisles with casual efficiency, issuing instructions with the practiced authority of people used to unquestioned compliance. The next, everything changed. Their steps slowed, their voices softened, and the quick confidence that had defined their movements vanished. Even passengers began noticing the subtle differences, catching glimpses of the unspoken realization that had settled like a weight over the crew. The lead attendant, who had been so certain moments earlier, now walked with a calculated caution. Her gestures were smaller, more measured, as if each motion required deliberate thought to ensure no further misstep. She checked her surroundings more often, her eyes darting toward the back where the man now sat quietly, observing everything yet revealing nothing. Each glance she cast carried a mixture of apprehension and respect, a silent acknowledgement that the assumptions they had made were wrong, and that correcting the error required careful navigation. Other attendants followed suit. The once brisk movements of serving snacks or assisting passengers slowed, replaced by cautious precision. They double-checked boarding passes, offered extra attention to seat assignments, and spoke in tones that were polite to the point of formality. Even routine announcements sounded slightly different, the words chosen more carefully, the cadence deliberate, as though the authority they had exercised so freely had suddenly been tempered by the gravity of the situation. Passengers began to pick up on the shift immediately. A man near the middle of the cabin nudged his friend, whispering about the strange energy in the air. Others noticed the attentive glances directed toward the back, toward the silent man whose presence now carried weight far beyond what they had imagined. The whispers that had once speculated on his supposed wrongdoing now faded, replaced by curiosity tinged with unease. People instinctively sensed that something significant had occurred, though few could articulate exactly what it was. The change in the crew was not merely procedural, it was emotional, too. There was a subtle tremor in their confidence, an almost imperceptible hesitation in their interactions, as though they were suddenly aware of the full consequences of their earlier actions. They moved with the understanding that every step, every word, and every gesture might now be scrutinized, either by the man himself or by the passengers who had begun to notice the tension in the air. The ordinary authority of the crew had been replaced by a fragile awareness of accountability, and their reactions were filtered through that lens. The purser, in particular, carried the weight of responsibility most visibly. Her eyes lingered a moment longer on the man seated in the back, not in judgment but in recognition. Every decision she made thereafter, whether to adjust the lighting, check on passengers, or address minor concerns, was tempered by an unspoken acknowledgement of his presence and influence. She coordinated the other attendants with quiet authority, her instructions precise, but her demeanor careful, as though even the smallest misstep could compound the earlier oversight. Even small gestures took on new meaning. A flight attendant offering water paused slightly longer, ensuring that the man received it first. Another attendant adjusted the overhead light above his seat, almost subconsciously prioritizing his comfort. Each action, while seemingly routine, carried with it an undercurrent of awareness, a subtle form of respect that hadn't existed before. It was not servility, it was recognition of the shift in power dynamics that had occurred quietly but unmistakably within the cabin. Passengers who had been casual observers now found themselves speculating again. But this time their speculation was different. There was no laughter, no judgment, no dismissive smirks. Instead, it was a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and cautious acknowledgement. The silent man at the back had, without a word, transformed the atmosphere of the entire flight. People sensed the invisible thread of authority he carried, the kind that commands attention without demanding it, and they instinctively adjusted their perceptions to accommodate it. The crew's reaction spread through the cabin like a ripple in still water. Where there had once been confidence, there was now a careful watchfulness. Where there had once been casual authority, there was deference tempered by understanding. Where there had once been whispers fueled by assumption, There was now silence tinged with awe. Even passengers who had previously speculated or judged now found themselves quietly observing, realizing that the true story was far more significant than the narrative they had created. And through it all, the man remained silent, calm, and composed. He did not seek acknowledgement, nor did he demand correction. He simply existed in the moment, allowing the crew and passengers alike to reconcile the image they had formed with the reality they had failed to see. His presence alone had altered the behavior of every person around him, demonstrating in the most subtle yet profound way that authority and respect are not always declared. They are often recognized in the quietest of ways, by those who understand the truth of a person's identity and the weight it carries.